I'm Meg Phillips. I'm NARA's External Affairs Liaison, and I'm actually also the sort of coordination point for the Electronic Records Management Automation Working Group, the sponsor of this series of webinars on agency experiences using automation. So I'm just going to say a couple of words of introduction about this series, and then I'll introduce our star, our presenter today. So one of NARA's commitments under the Managing Government Records Directive was the exploration and encouragement of automated solutions for electronic records management. That was goal A31 of the Presidential Directive. The belief is that automated solutions can increase the consistency and effectiveness of electronic records management while also reducing the burden of managing electronic records on the end user. So the Electronic Records Management Automation Working Group was organized last year to participate in exploring these tools. The working group gathers and shares information from vendors about automated tools that are out there on the market now, and we're also gathering information from other agencies, our peers, about their automation projects so that we can all learn from each other. So today's presentation is part of that series of agency presentations where we talk to each other as peers about what we've tried, what problems we've solved, what worked well, and what was a challenge. Susan's presentation today is on NARA's implementation of the Capstone approach to managing email. But today she's really focusing on the perspective that Capstone is one way of automating email management and reducing the burden of records management on the end users while also improving the effectiveness of electronic records management. So Susan has presented a couple of other times on the Capstone implementation at NARA. Her other presentations have really focused on the policy level of that implementation. So this is really more of a deep dive into the technical side from that ERM automation angle. So without further ado, let me introduce our speaker today, who's Susan Sullivan, who's the Director of Corporate Records Management and NARA's Records Officer. I'll also say, Susan may be following up on this thought today, Susan has announced that she is leaving the National Archives, and we're very, very sorry to hear that, but she's moving on to not so much greener pastures, but whiter ski slopes. She's moving to Aspen. So this is going to be one of Susan's last splashes, but making sure that she has a chance to transfer what she's learned to us in the electronic records management. So with that, let me turn it over to Susan.
Hello, everybody. This is Susan Sullivan. I hope you can hear me. If you can't hear me, please chat to our moderator and let him know. I am using my speakerphone. I will tell you I'm in the D.C. area, and spring is starting to spring. I am having my spring allergies, and if I start coughing, I hope you can bear with me. If I lose my voice, we'll just power through it. I'm happy to talk to you today about my story of NARA's Capstone email implementation. This is a technical perspective. It's as technical as it gets for a records manager. And with that, I'm going to move ahead into my slides. I'll be speaking for about 40 minutes. Then we'll open it up to questions. And the moderator will read the questions out loud, and I will do my best to answer them. So here we go. The overview is pretty much what I've been asked to present. I've kind of reorganized some of the points to flow better with the presentation. You can read the bullet points. I don't think I need to articulate them. But hopefully it'll get through and tell you a full story of what we did here at NARA, and hopefully you will be able to use some of this information if you plan to do this yourself. So the first part is how we procured this system. And obviously it takes a village, it takes a team. And we developed a team of our internal stakeholders to lead the Capstone approach and meet NARA's business needs. The team included myself, corporate records management, and other people from my staff. The office of our general counsel was very, very involved and very much a leader. Those of you who know Jason Barron know that he's a big advocate of simplifying records management, and I'll go into a little more about what that means for Capstone. Our Chief Information Officer was actually the champion of the project, and he had a staff member who was a contracting officer, and we also had a very, very good project manager who kept everything running and on the tracks the way it needed to go. As you know, NARA has the Office of the Chief Records Officer, which in contrast to my job is the NARA Records Officer. I'm responsible for managing NARA's own business records, much like many other records officers in the federal government. The Office of the Chief Records Officer is more about government-wide guidance and information. So we had them on board because they had done a lot of work with the Capstone approach, and we kind of wanted their buy-in and guidance as we went through the process. And of course, we had other members of senior leadership who were monitoring and supporting the process as we went along. This team of people were very important in making everything happen, and I would suggest a similar team if you were planning to do something along these lines. Moving on. So the procurement process started like many other systems procurement process. We used the planning portion of CPIC to highlight all the technical and business concerns and to outline the appropriate requirements. This took our entire team. We did a business needs summary, and we discussed that at architectural review board meetings. So that kind of vetted it throughout the rest of the agency. We emphasized the need for the contract solicitation to clearly articulate things like service level agreements, data conversion, reporting requirements, and of course, records management requirements. It prompted an assessment of current bandwidth utilization and impact on NARA's network. So there was a lot of other considerations besides just records management. The business units then reviewed and commented on the draft business case, requirements, and objectives, so everybody's needs were accommodated. There are various business and technical teams that worked on this. The team I mentioned before was considered the Records Management Integrated Project Team, but we had integrated project teams for conversion, we had communications, we had security, so pretty much every aspect of the project was covered by a project team. The contract was awarded in September 2012, and we started with status reports tracking scope, risk, schedule, costs, and all those were reviewed weekly at these project meetings to monitor the implementation. We also had additional briefings at what we call stage gate reviews that were held before our pilot users and our early adopters were initiated, and I'll explain what the pilot and early adopters were in a minute. We did design reviews and risk reviews. We ended up awarding a firm fixed price contract under the Federal Supply Schedule order under a cloud-based email solution under GSA. And those of you who understand procurement understand this better than I do. And the schedule was the Federal Supply Schedule 70. Moving on. So the group that I was involved in worked up the basic records management requirements, and these are summarized. The idea was to have an email management solution integrated with the messaging system. And we wanted to retain the functionality and integrity of the content throughout the full records lifecycle. But we wanted some flexibility. We wanted to be able to automate the capture of email messages in an open format, but we wanted to have some exceptions. We wanted to be able to implement automated rules for non-capture because we did a pilot or a proof of concept before this where we learned that sometimes you don't want to capture all your emails, and we wanted to allow people time to call out non-records. And I'll talk about that in a little while. Another exception was in order to allow people to have an impact on their email, we had a combination of the automated rules and the manual actions that people could actually implement to override the automated rules in place. This took a little bit of thought and a little bit of explanation for our contractors once we got the contract. So what information is managed in our system? Well, of course, email messages and attachments. And when you think about Google Apps, you can think about the type of content that's easily available in their, quote, email system. Email messages and attachments, calendars and appointments, tasks that are part of calendars, chat transcripts that are moved into a mailbox, and I'm going to say right here that those chat transcripts that are manually moved into a mailbox are then captured and managed as email messages, along with the rest of the email messages. We had to designate an effective date for the Capstone approach, and we picked January 22nd, 2013. So anything created or received after January 21st are subject to automatic capture and categorization as permanent or temporary records under Capstone by default. I get a lot of questions about volumes processed. So we have 5,300 Google licenses, about 5,000 are in use. We migrated over 4,500 accounts, 12 million messages, 2 terabytes of data. We use Google Groups for mailboxes such as my group's mailbox is recordsmatter@nara.gov, and now that's represented by a Google group. We also migrated 400 BlackBerry devices to support this cloud-based offering. The functions we automated are automated journaling of email, which means as every email message is sent and received, it is captured in the database. However, for record-keeping purposes, we use a capture mechanism called crawling. The journaling is for e-discovery only. It's kind of a backup, and we're going to use the journal data to compare what people declare as records versus what doesn't get declared as records. So we're automating capture, we're automating records declaration through rules, and through the records management application, or RMA, which is pretty standard because it is certified to DoD 5015.2, which is a set of requirements for records management applications, and it complies with the Code of Federal Regulations. So the RMA has the capability to automatically destroy temporary records after a certain time period, and it also can implement search, legal holds. It will allow you to restore a saved message to Gmail. It can do reports, and it will allow file export for transfer of permanent records to the National Archives, or for whatever other reason you may need to use your file export. So we've been talking about Capstone a lot, and for those of you who don't know what Capstone means, it's kind of depicted here by the picture of the pyramid. The capstone means that the top of the pyramid, meaning the people at the top of the agency who are the top decision makers, are by their records and email messages under Capstone are permanent. They are permanent retention. Everybody else's are temporary. And then you have a large amount of information that may be non-record as well. We chose to deal with the non-record. Some people choose not to deal with the non-record because it takes manual intervention to deal with non-records. In our case, we do kind of a half and half. We use automation and manual intervention to deal with the non-records. in our proof of concept we did before we actually implemented Capstone, we learned that a large amount of email messages can be non-record. And we determined that it made sense to keep those non-records out if possible. But it's not mandatory that individuals interact with the system to call out the non-records. It's just an available option to them. We found that there are a lot of people who don't want their lunch appointments, listserv messages, little back and forth with their coworkers caught up in the email system and saved for 7 years. We found that a lot of people are very sensitive about their email. A lot of people communicate very informally in email, and it's almost like their soul is in there. They're very, very sensitive about it. So we addressed that with creating a non-record part of our Capstone implementation. So if you think about our technical approach, we integrated 3 clouds, and if you want to call them clouds, you've got the Google Apps for Government, you've got our RMA, which is ZL Unified Archive, which is the vendor name and the product name, and we integrated the BlackBerries. We migrated the server-based email that was sitting in GroupWise. We migrated the calendar and the contacts, and then we went after everybody's personal archives, which were, if you're familiar with GroupWise, were stored on shared drives or in personal drives. We had to go out and find them and migrate those, as well as FileSurf, which is our legacy RMA application. We had a small implementation of FileSurf with about 30 users, but we needed to migrate the records that were saved in FileSurf, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. We had to implement a single sign-on solution for users in the office so that they were signed on to the system when they logged in at the office, and when the teleworking community needed to log on. Right now, there's a 2-factor authentication solution that you've probably seen in other applications where you go in and you set up your cell phone or voicemail to receive a code, and then the system sends you a code and you type it in and then you can get into the system. This actually replaced a system that we had. We had the RSA tokens, which we've all since turned in, and I'm so glad now that I don't have to keep track of that token anymore. So that's pretty much the overall approach for getting the data migrated and integrated together. As far as records management goes, first we had the contractor convert and migrate the GroupWise messages to Gmail. This took some doing because GroupWise is a proprietary format. Once all of your mailbox data, everything that was live in your mailbox got migrated into Gmail, then we used the crawling technology within the records management application to go into the Gmail boxes and crawl the Gmail into our records management application. For those archive files I talked to you about that were stored on drives, our contractor had to go and actually convert those into PST files. Those of you that are familiar with PST files, they are kind of I'll say a zipped file that is associated with Microsoft Outlook. Then what we did was we imported the GroupWise archives directly into the RMA as convenience copies. And the reason why we did this is because we're an agency of archivists, and our culture here is to keep things and go back and do research. What did we say? What did we do? Our user community wanted their old emails. So we went to the trouble This was some of the information we gathered early on when we did requirements. People didn't want to lose those old emails that had been around for a while. I'll talk about retention of those in a little while. Once everything was in the RMA, then we were ready to make it available to the users. And this was something that was kind of new to me, because in order for people to get to the RMA through Gmail, they had to install something called a Gadget. And if you're familiar with Gmail, sometimes your calendars are considered a gadget, or there's other, they're almost like apps that you can get to through gadgets. So we had to give people instructions on how to install the ZLUA Gadget. Once they installed that, and I'll actually show you what that looks like in a few minutes, people could access the RMA, and there goes someone's calling me, so please bear with me till they get hung up on. Then once they could access the RMA through the Gadget, then they could search, view, recategorize their email, actually work with the email that was captured in the RMA as needed. So our timeline, we did this in an amazingly short amount of time. This is 2013. So, excuse me. Yes, I do like yes. That was my phone, which I thought I had turned off. Anyway, let me turn it off all the way. So, in early May, we did user acceptance testing, and we selected a group of IT pilot users, about 30 people. They were mostly people that were involved in the IPTs, that were involved in working through requirements and all that. They were our power users. By June, we had a group of early adopters, mostly volunteers, about 300 people, and they were actually part of testing their Gmail, and we rolled out the Gadget to everybody, and we gave them, we tested our guidance on them, and got feedback from them, adjusted our guidance, and by the end of June, we had everybody else ready to go with Gmail. At that point, we were rolling in all of the group-wise archives, and we got all the archives in for the permanent officials at the top of that capstone that I talked about. And by the end of September, we had our permanent officials having access to their data in our RMA. By October, we had all of the group-wise archives converted and migrated to the RMA, and by November, everybody in the agency had access to the RMA if they installed their Gadget. So, again, I want to talk a little bit about the effective date and the record-keeping implications of that. So, if it was sent or received before our effective date, the email messages in the RMA are considered convenience copies. We determined that our print and file policy that was in effect before January 22nd was the policy that applied to those emails. So we did not automatically capture those as a permanent or temporary record. However, if a user felt that they had some email messages that they wanted to file and retain under Capstone that they may not have printed and filed, they could actually go in through the RMA, the Unified Archive, and categorize that as a record under Capstone. If it was sent or received after January 21st, then the records would automatically be crawled and filed in the RMA based on the user role, permanent official, temporary official, and a label if present. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the labels in a minute. We use labels in Gmail to help us influence how records were filed during the crawl, if necessary. So, this is how the records are declared in the RMA file plan. And I will tell you, our vendor from ZL Unified Archive, it took us 2 weeks to explain this to them because they came into the National Archives very excited and expecting to have a very detailed file plan and a model file plan, the typical hierarchical file plan. And we came to the table and we said, we want 3 categories, permanent, temporary, and non-record. They just couldn't believe us. So we had to explain it in very many ways. And don't be surprised if you run into this again. Maybe all of these discussions about Capstone will pave the way for you. So I'm going to describe the permanent one in detail, and the temporary one works pretty much the same way. So for senior officials, and I'll show you what the rule looks like in a little while, if you're on the list of senior officials, and we have 48 people identified as senior officials, when the crawler goes through, and it automatically declares all of the email messages, calendar appointments, tasks, everything I mentioned before, as permanent. Now, if someone else, a temporary person, uses a Gmail label on their email messages and they label their messages as permanent, the crawler will take those messages and file them under the permanent file plan. And also, if someone decides that their records are permanent after they're captured and they're by default captured as temporary, a person can recategorize their records as permanent in the RMA during a specific period of time, which we call safe harbor. Again, people can manually categorize pre-effective date messages as permanent under Capstone using that permanent folder in the file plan. The same thing applies for temporary, except that it's the default for everybody else. And if senior officials label their emails as temporary, they will not be captured in the permanent folder by default. They will be captured in the temporary folder. You can imagine that takes a little bit of training. And again, the temporary folder is available for recategorizing existing records that were captured by the crawler or manually categorizing messages before the effective date. The non-record folder only exists in ZL Unified Archive, and it's for recategorizing messages that are non-record, were captured as temporary and permanent and are non-records. So we got a lot of requests for that during our requirements phase, and so we accommodated that by including a non-record category as part of our file plan. And so therefore you have it, 3 different file folders, permanent, temporary, and non-record. So a little bit about safe harbor. One thing we learned during our proof of concept was, as I mentioned, people didn't want useless non-records captured and preserved in the records management application. So we gave a certain period of time before capture. So we've programmed our records management application and our crawler to look at the create and receive date of email messages and don't capture anything until they're 90 days old. So that gives people time to delete useless non-records or apply a Gmail label to non-record information that they want to keep. For example, I get a lot of information about record keeping and references, and I keep those as a non-record label, and I have a sub-label, record keeping information. So I can keep that. I know it's a non-record, but it's in my Gmail. It's also in ZLUA. It's not in ZLUA. ZLUA actually eliminates or goes over, doesn't pick up the non-record information, the non-record labeled, things that are labeled as non-records in Gmail. One more time. Our crawler is programmed to skip non-records that are in Gmail, and those are identified as non-records by labels. I'll show you how we do labels in a little bit. When records are labeled as temporary or permanent, it can override the default Capstone retention policy. So the safe harbor gives people time to label their records as temporary or permanent so that they can override their default category. We have another safe harbor on the RMA side. So after capture, people have time to review what was captured in the RMA and change the default category, for example, from temporary to non-record, or from temporary to permanent, or vice versa. This was the manual type of flexibility that we found was necessary and people actually wanted. This is really not required as part of the Capstone email approach as our guidance from the other side of NARA, the Chief Records Officer, has provided. This is something that we have done internally as part of our requirements gathering. So a little bit about the logic and about how everything is declared as a record. As I mentioned before, we have journaling turned on. It captures all messages sent and received for e-discovery purposes and for RM quality monitoring. We have crawling turned on for records management. It's rules-based. It acts on the labels if they're applied. As I tried to clearly mention before, it excludes non-records, deleted messages, draft messages, and spam. It supports our safe harbor policy because we have that programmed into our crawler. But be aware that crawling did require extra security because the system actually goes into people's email boxes, and so it uses IMAP protocols to do that. I don't know the details of all that, but I will tell you it was a concern in the beginning. We didn't even know that we would be able to crawl, but we knew we wanted that functionality. So our declaration policy kind of looks like this. The crawler captures messages when they're not spam, draft, or trash, when the date sent or received is greater than our safe harbor period, X number calendar of days, and there's no non-record label. The next question is the user a designated senior official? If yes, file is permanent, if not labeled as temporary. If no, file is temporary, if not labeled as permanent. But I must clarify here that labeling and deletion is not required and is optional, because we also found that there are people who don't have time to manage their email, they don't want to manage their email, and they really don't care what's captured in the records management application as permanent or temporary. So this accommodates the majority of everybody as far as how the amount of work they want to use in capturing their email. So this is an example of how we use labels to declare or to skip records. So So for example, if you're familiar with Gmail, you can go into the labeling part of the application and you can select a label. This is an example of how people can label their messages one at a time based on the content. So this one was about travel. I have a category and a subcategory, non-record broadcast. So all of the NARA-wide messages that go to everybody, I have identified as that. So I selected the message, I picked my label, I applied my label. 1, 2, 3. The best way to do it is using filters. So I've gotten to the point now where at any given time I can look at my inbox and my messages are already labeled because I've been doing it long enough that I've gone in, I've picked the message. The message here is a message from our internal collaboration network, which is like our internal Facebook or our internal wikis and blogs. So we get a lot of, I'm set to get a lot of notifications from that system, and I like to see those, but I didn't want them captured in the system, and I kind of wanted them all together. So I filtered those. So I selected the message, and it really takes, a couple of screens to do this. You select the message, you say filter message like these, messages like these, and then the system creates a filter for those kind of messages, and from that day forward, all those messages are filed the same way. So here's just an overview of the whole process I've kind of just described to show you a visual of it. So you'll see on the left side, all Gmail sent and received is copied out of Gmail. It's journaled. Then we apply the crawling software, which is represented here by a spider. Back to the left side, users have the options to do nothing. They can delete, they can label, they can filter. When the crawler comes through, it looks for messages that are, in our case, 90 days old, and it applies the records management rules for email messages sent and received after January 21st. Then it crawls them into ZI Unified Archive, and actually the journaled email is the main file that's copied. We only keep one copy in the system. The system has multiple applications that views these messages. So once the crawler comes through, it applies metadata to those existing messages. If they're identified as records, the journaled messages then inherit the property of the records. So the three applications that we use right now are on the middle part of the screen here to the right. We use the Records Manager, the eDiscovery, and the crawlers. The thing that we have in the Records Management application are retention rules. We have a file plan with permanent, temporary, and non-record folders. And in ZL Unified Archive, we have a safe harbor that will allow people to do refiling. The Z, above the Z, we represent the Gadget, which we use to access ZL Unified Archive. So this is just kind of like my picture of the whole system. I hope it makes sense to you. I hope it works in review for you. But we're going to continue on. So here's an example of how our capture rules look in ZL Unified Archive. And you can see that at the very top, it's logical. At the very top, if it says non-record, we don't archive it. If it's earlier than a certain date, we don't archive it. And we actually we actually put in a list of known broadcast email addresses in our system so that we didn't capture broadcast messages. So that's what you see here. So without people even labeling their broadcast messages as such, we exclude those from capture in the records management application. All of the messages are still available in Gmail, and the users can maintain those as long as they want, subject to a certain storage requirement, and I believe that's 25 gig. Here's an example of our records declaration rules. Again, if the message is earlier than a certain date, do not declare. In this one, the second one is looking for that label. It's called a sync property. If it contains the phrase temporary, declare it as a record, and it's older than 90 days. If it's greater than 90 days old, this is actually the declaration rule for a permanent official. Then declare it as a record, and then declare it as a permanent record. So for a senior official, by default, their records will be permanent unless it's labeled as temporary. So that's what this rule is really showing. So there's a logic to it, which is shown here. Here's an example of the behind-the-scenes Capstone account rules. And this really doesn't show what's going on behind the scenes, but I just wanted to show you, you'll know Mike Walsh is our CIO. His mailbox archiving is on. The archiving policy is another policy that depends on this rule. Stubbing policy is the same thing. And the mailbox records declaration policy is the one that we have named as Capstone Permanent. So this is kind of a summary of his account and how it's managed. So this is how the rule looks, how you develop the rule that acts on the labels. So this is a rule for a Capstone official that says, that allows a Capstone official who's by default permanent to label their records as temporary and for the system to actually see it as such and file that under the temporary file plan. These slides will be made available to you after the presentation so that you can look at these in more detail. So, what were our implementation challenges? As you can imagine, user actions. Because we realized that, a lot of records are not just email records. We have case files here. Those of you who work with appraisal archivists know that we have record scheduling case files that have a lot of back and forth, a lot of analysis, a lot of other different kinds of files involved in them, pen and ink changes, signatures. So we had to implement a policy that said, if an email message is part of a case file, save a copy of your hard copy email back to print and file with related records outside of the RMA. And we also, that's the most manual thing we ended up having to maintain is, right along the lines of our older policies. But we also recommend that our users facilitate exclusions by auto-filing and by using labels and filters. And of course, they may choose to do nothing. What we've also found is people start out labeling and filtering, and after a while they get bored with it and they don't care anymore. And the information just flows into the system, which is fine. We implemented those policies to meet their needs. Another challenge was training. So the ZL Unified Archive tool was something different that people had never seen before. And one of the things that we had to really communicate was the different views that were available when the users looked into the application. What you see here is a records view where you can see the records are identified with R, and but the archive view will let you look at your records and see how you had them labeled. So they're kind of organized by your labels if you use the labels. So every view has something different. And so we had to train everybody on each view. We put together a user's guide too. The system has some really good search capabilities, and it really does facilitate the ability to recategorize records if you want to. It allows you, as I said before, to refile your archive messages or even restore it back to your Gmail box. Also, the Gadget. The Gadget was tough because we had to give them some very specific instructions about how to install their Gadget. We had to tell them the email was coming with a Gadget installation instructions and a user's guide, and then we had to give them step-by-step instructions on how to install their Gadget, and once they installed their Gadget, how to use their Gadget to open up ZL Unified Archive. What I want to say here is currently, as with GroupWise and Gmail, everybody's RMA mailbox is currently limited to each user. So right now we don't have departmental access, like everybody in the same department doesn't have access to all the email that's stored in the RMA. We're still determining the logistics to deal with that. We have a lot of users who are very specific about who may and may not see their email. This is a challenge of Capstone, and you need to be aware of it. As far as the journal file, we allow certain authorized users to have access to that. Currently, we have proposed a 1-year retention for that journal file. And as far as access goes, we have a directive that addresses the privacy of the information on NAR systems, which basically says if you're working on NAR's network, you have no expectation of privacy. That said, people still believe that a lot of their information is still private, and they, like I said, they feel their soul is in there and their personality is in there, their thoughts and their feelings are in there. We're dealing with human beings here, and these are real requirements that you're going to have to deal with when you start talking about automatically archiving and managing people's email. Another big implementation challenge we had was migrating our legacy RMA. Our legacy RMA had a lot of permanent records in it because we had the archivist using it, the deputy archivist using it. So before we migrated those records, we pre-accessioned the eligible permanent records into the National Archives. And in order to do that, we had to convert a lot of that information that was in a proprietary format to an open format. So what was left, we had to export again for import into ZL Unified Archive for migration, and we had to try to reproduce the user access that people were used to in our former RMA in a different security framework. And we are actually still working on that because the ZL Unified Archive application doesn't have the same kind of functionality as our older application. And so we're looking at how to implement group access for various types of data within that application. As you are familiar with, that requires a lot of requirements gathering and working with the users and determining what the user groups are and at what level you can provide access. the users of the former system had to be trained on the new system, and the data in the new system didn't look the same as it did in the old system. So, and last but not least, definitely not least, we ended up having to do an add-on to our contract because our contract was rather ambiguous. Our contract required migration of all email archives, but it didn't specifically call out our RMA. So when the amount of work that it took was understood by the contractor, we actually needed to create a contract add-on because we agreed that the full scope of migrating that data wasn't accounted for in the contract. So be aware of that. That's a very important thing. So as I mentioned, we pre-accessioned the permanent records from the RMA first, quite a bit of data. And for the rest of the data, we created a data dump. We went back into the database, created a dump, and did also an export in HTML format so that we could validate that our dump was good data after we did the migration. And we transferred the records in the metadata, which means the file plans, everything else that goes with all of that data into the new RMA. So then it took quite a while, and we migrated over 250,000 messages and files into the new RMA. And we're still sorting a lot of that out. So what does it take to maintain a system like this? We have a contractor service level agreement. Users call the help desk when they have problems with ZL Unified Archive or questions, or even labeling in Gmail. The help desk gets our typical, local help desk reaches out to our email cloud contractor, and the email cloud contractor assists them directly. We put together training and users manuals, and someone's got to maintain and administer that RMA. So if we have to add or change senior officials or change our crawling rules, basically the contractor does that as part of their service level agreement. But we have to put together the configuration requirements on the front end as the National Archives and as part of the integrated project team that I mentioned to you before. So that IPT often reconvenes to discuss existing issues and next steps. And then, as part of corporate records management, we identified a position and hired someone as an ERM specialist to kind of oversee not only Capstone, but all of our electronic records initiatives. So a little bit more about the ERM specialist. As I said, he administers the agency electronic record keeping system. He actually supports governance strategy and training for Capstone, for our cloud-based email system, and for other electronic records management initiatives. He developed our draft Capstone schedule, and he also coordinates and maintains schedules for NAR's systems and all data that are maintained in NAR's electronic information systems. So he's our person on the ground who gets out there and goes to the CPIC meetings and works with project managers and makes sure that electronic record keeping is integrated into these systems. We thought that one point of contact for that was appropriate, considering that we had this RMA in place and we wanted to centralize this information and this knowledge under one person. Of course, our other staff members are also knowledgeable, but he has the final word, and it's his job to focus on electronic records management. So what are our lessons learned? This is something I already brought out. Explicitly include migration of existing email repositories in your contracts and plans. And work early to migrate those email repositories and legacy email know that that's going to take the most time, and work on that first. Number 3 is something that we're facing a big challenge with, maintaining that Capstone officials list. These senior officials change jobs, they move, they act, they are in acting positions, they leave, and depending on the size of your agency and how many Capstone officials you have, we haven't yet identified an automated way to do this, because there is no central database that says Capstone officials. Now, if we can figure out a way to work with our personnel systems and create some metadata around that, maybe we'll be able to solve that problem. But I'm going to be honest with you, this is an issue at this point. This is something that you need to think about. And it also has a lot of bearing on how many Capstone officials that you actually identify. Establishing a common understanding with your vendors and contractors. As I mentioned before when we talked about our file plan, they didn't get it. When we talked about the ability to use labels and override our default policies, it took about 3 weeks of constant meetings and going over the requirements again and again and again until we got the same language and we understood each other and we had a common understanding. User communication is extremely important. We let everybody know when they join NARA now that their email is going to be automatically captured. And then we point them to our guidance and other information about how they can intervene if they want to, or how it's not required if they don't want to. But if they are going to want to intervene and override the automatic processes, they may need extra time to manage their legacy email. So, for example, when we moved the archives into ZL Unified Archives, people were concerned about what got moved in there. This is in an archive system now and everybody can see it, or other people can see it. We reminded them that only you have access to your inbox, but there were a lot of people going in and doing searches and deleting emails from their husbands, their banks, things like that, which goes back to training where you let people know that, this is your work email. Don't have your doctor sending information to there, or don't have that as the default email on your account balance at your bank. These are simple things, but people do this because they like to be notified right away, and when they're at work, there it pops up on their screen. So they use the system in that way. If you're going to use Capstone, you need to have a record schedule behind it to support it. We have one drafted right now. I believe it's shared on our archives.gov site. It's still in draft. We have policies, which also are still in draft and depend on the record schedule so that people can understand. And the policies become the central point of all your training, which is so important with user communications and training. We created a website on our NARA at Work page, which is our intranet page, and we put updates there every day, and we went on to our NARA at Work main page, and we created news items, and we linked to it, and I blogged about it, and I kind of blitzed the market as much as I could, and there were still people that didn't know about Capstone and that we were capturing their emails automatically. Although I will say I went to a staff meeting and mentioned it at a certain point, and I got a little bit of eye rolling. I'm like, does everybody know about Capstone and your email being captured automatically? And they're like, yeah, we know. So I guess that meant success. So I can't underemphasize the need to communicate. And I think I jumped ahead on my slide, but we did briefings. I did a blog. I was blogging every day. It almost became like an addiction. I would come in and, what can I blog about today? It was like being a diarist. I was journaling, and it became something that I wanted to do every day, and there was always something to say. So what you see here on the right is our Capstone email management page, and kind of like, there's our news and updates, and we have FAQs on there, we have slides, we have screenshots, we have users manuals, and you don't want to overwhelm people, but you want to really present the information so that people can use it and are not overwhelmed by it. You don't want to make them angry. Some people like to get angry. Our future plans, we hope to get our record schedule approved and implement more and new policy and training. Since we have this RMA available to us now, we want to implement our capital planning and improvement control processes so that we can expand to more data types, so that we don't have to print and file emails with case files, so that we can move our unstructured data from our share drives into our RMA application. We want to be able to go into the ZL Unified Archive and do back-end data analysis and clean up and really look at how this Capstone capture is working. How much non-record are we really getting? And what can we do about it? How much actual records are being missed? We want to be able to take the time to do that, and our ERM specialists can actually do that. And like I said, all of that can help us refine our capture policies and rules. This is something new. It's going to get better. We admit that we don't have all the answers, but we are trying to get this right, and we are dedicating the resources and time that we need to do this. So just in summary, ultimately we have a new cloud email system. It's in Gmail or Google Apps for Government. ZL Unified Archive is our record-keeping repository for our email records. And it captures and manages our email electronically in compliance with Section 1.2 of the Presidential Directive. And for those of you that don't know about that, it is a new directive that requires agencies to manage their permanent email electronically by 2016, and all permanent records electronically by 2019. So when I developed our report at the end of this year, there were several questions about how NARA was planning to manage our email electronically, and I was able to answer those in the positive because of our work with Capstone. Also, we manage our records prior to our effective date under previous policies, and that was a management decision that we had to make, and it's a decision that anybody else that implements this will have to make as well. And I think I've actually gone over 40 minutes. I think I've gone to 65 minutes. So now I guess I'm ready for questions.
All right, that sounds good, Susan. We did receive quite a few questions. I'll start with the first one that arrived. Are all non-records journaled for 1 year?
Yes.
All right, the second question, can you give us some indication of what it costs to purchase and or develop the system from Schedule 70?
I actually don't know that, but I can find out and pass that information along to Meg.
All right. The next question, will the mailbox archiving rule be set up only for outbox only, since it's only the outbox that would be considered official record from an originator standpoint? Is that correct?
All sent and received email, inbox and outbox. Everything that I talked about in the scope, calendar appointments, tasks, email messages, sent and received.
Okay, that sounds good. And before I go to the next question, just a quick reminder to our participants, if you would like to submit a question, you may use the Send Note button at the top of your screen or the chat box and address your questions to all moderators or presenters. The next question, what is the crawler? Is it ZL Technologies?
Yes, it is. And I'll go a little bit further and say, in the beginning, whenever these records management applications were first developed, they were pretty much repositories, record-keeping repositories. Then functionality for document management was added to them. Then e-discovery was added to them. And now they're kind of all unified systems where these crawlers are working with them because it was discovered that people were not manually filing their records as the systems had been designed to do. So what we're finding now are these unified packages that can actually do these automated capture rules and crawling and automate a lot of this and make it a lot easier for the agency to implement.
Great. The next question, did you work with the union on this?
Yeah, the union was involved. I didn't work directly with them, but our senior management always works with the union on everything. And so there's my answer to that. Not me, but it was covered.
All right. The next question, what is the litigation hold identification and notification process?
That's integrated into the ZL Unified Archive. And it's part of our policy when records come under litigation hold, we notify the users and they identify records, but we can actually use the search technology within the system to put these records on hold. And once they're identified as being on hold, that metadata is applied to the record and the retention is suspended on those records until that hold is released.
All right. There were a group of questions which I'll just group into one, asking simply if this presentation will be made available after the conclusion of today's webinar.
Yes, I will leave that up to Meg. She's working with the Chief Records Officers group, and there's a page on archives.gov where Capstone information is being maintained. I would assume that the presentation will be placed up there.
I believe we're actually recording the whole thing, and we're going to be working with the records management training folks to make it available in the way that we often do training things. So this is a little different from the way we've done other automation presentations.
Perfect. The next question, if RMA mailbox is limited to users, does that mean that a non-user can use Gmail but cannot declare an email as a record or non-record?
Can you say that again?
Certainly. If RMA mailbox is limited to users, does that mean that a non-user can use Gmail but cannot declare an email as a record or non-record?
A non-Gmail user?
So
I'm going to ask you to read that one more time.
Yeah, if RMA mailbox is limited to users, does it mean that a non-user can use Gmail but cannot declare an email as a record?
Maybe we should ask the person who asked that question to clarify, because I think we're getting confused because every NARA employee is a Gmail user and would be covered by this policy. So other than people outside the National Archives, there isn't a gap between the two categories. But maybe the person can ask a follow-up question and make sure we understand.
Yeah, I think to clarify, the person who has the question just sent in another note that says your slide showed that the RMA mailbox is only limited to users.
Right. So each user has their Gmail account and a ZL Unified Archive account, both of which access is only available to them. Think of them as a pair, the two clouds working together. No one else except for administrators right now is going to be able to get into the Gmail or the ZL Unified Archive account. Those are yours, as if, just like your usual email account.
Okay, I think that clarified the answers. We just got a thank you message from the person who asked the question, so it's good. Moving on to the next question. I entered the webinar a few minutes late due to connectivity issues. Were attachments discussed?
No, they weren't, but attachments are captured as part of the email messages and maintained in their native format and inextricably linked with the parent email.
All right, the next question. How long are you going to keep the pre-January 22nd messages in ZL archives? How long are you keeping the journal file?
Keeping the journal file right now is proposed to be kept for a year. The pre-Capstone emails, we have yet to determine how long we're keeping those.
All right, the next question. Is your ERM specialist a federal position or a contractor?
Federal position.
Terrific. Before I move on to the next question, just a quick reminder to our participants, if you would like to ask a question, you may use the Send Note button at the top of your screen or the chat box and address your questions to all moderators or presenters. The next question asks, how did you prevent users from manually making a record a non-record and vice versa?
We don't prevent that. We use training to educate them. We hope to use analytics to analyze if that's happening, to determine if that's happening and address that after the fact. But right now, the Capstone approach is kind of like an honor system, and we're allowing people to delete, label, and manage their email as they see fit. Great.
The next question, have you received any feedback from other agencies using Capstone that do not use Gmail? Has it worked for them, or are there any issues of note?
I've had some informal conversations, and there appears to be some issues with capturing and preserving chats, but it's not an issue for us because our chats get they're actually moved manually into Gmail, and then they're managed as email messages from there. But apparently there's some preservation format issues or conversion format issues with chats. That's all I know about. Not a lot of agencies have implemented Capstone yet.
All right. There's another question. I realize the presentation is being recorded and will be available via nara.gov, but can we get a copy of the slides only?
We can arrange for that, and as I said, they will likely be posted on the archives.gov page, management section.
All right, and I believe that was actually the last of our questions here in the queue.
Great. Well, if there aren't any more questions, I want to thank Susan for giving such a good presentation and giving us some insight into what it's like to really implement this. And wearing my electronic records management automation hat, I'm just struck by how clearly this is a good example of a rules-driven automation system where there's a default rule, and then people can execute special rules using labels to get even more nuanced things to happen. But the blanket rule will make generally the right thing happen, even if people do nothing else. So I think it's a wonderful example of an automated approach, and I want to thank Susan again for taking the time to talk to everybody. We will get a note out one way or another about where we're posting the slide recordings. I will definitely send that notice to the ERM Automation Working Group, and we'll figure out how to spread the word even further than that. So thank you very much.